Hey folks, Sean here, and in this episode, I want to talk to you about why you need to remain laser focused on exactly who you're building for. When I say what I mean is your B2B SaaS product. Who specifically is it for? As in, who's your target market? Who's that buyer persona? Who has the problems worth solving that you're trying to help? The reason why I mention this is because once you start gaining some traction with your product, it's entirely possible and even likely that ideas are just going to fly at you fast from people that are using your product, even people that aren't. So it can get really noisy really fast. And this is where it's going to test your resolve in terms of your ability to remain laser focused on precisely who you're building for. And if you haven't defined that right out of the gate, it gets a little bit harder to do, but this is an opportunity to get definitive about that. And that's a good thing. The more definitive you are about who your customer is and who they aren't, the easier it's going to be to understand which ideas make sense or which problems worth solving you should be chasing and which ones you should not. The easiest distinction here for those of us building B2B SaaS products, applications that we're trying to turn into profitable businesses, is the business versus consumer argument. Now, I'm building a podcast post-production kind of automation tool at the moment called Podcast Show Notes, and that can be, in terms of who the customer is for that product, that can be podcast agencies, so specific businesses that basically manage podcasts for businesses, or podcast hosts. And I would consider the former example to be a business and the latter to be a consumer. So one would be B2B and the other would be B2C. Now, if I tried to build around the needs of both, it's going to kind of turn my product into a convoluted mess. Or I should say, that's the first step on a slippery slope that really leads to your product becoming a mess, because you're trying to build around the needs of two potentially very different target market customers. And I know they sound similar, but the needs are definitely different. I'll give you just one example. For the podcast agencies, for the most part, they have teams of people helping their customers with managing the podcast. The consumers, on the other hand, which are probably just podcast hosts, they may be doing everything themselves. They may not have a team of people. So something like user management may make sense for the podcast agency, but it may not make any sense for the podcast host or the consumer variation. So just with that example, you can see how almost an entire module that might get built into your product would be used or leveraged very differently depending upon who you're building around. Now, the B2B versus B2B distinction can be a little bit easier to see, but sometimes not. Really, what the challenge is here is avoiding chasing a market that can be very difficult to figure out where the patterns are. And this is why I love building around businesses, is because they have long-term goals in mind and they stick to them for the most part. They have to, right? They define plans, they put a lot of time, effort, energy, money into building these long-term plans, and your objective is to help them achieve those. That's the successful outcome they're trying to generate for our B2B customers. Consumers, on the other hand, I've always felt is like herding cats. I'm sure you've heard some variation of that phrase before, but there's just a lot of opinions, there's a lot of inconsistency, and it's very difficult to define the patterns around there. Also, there may or may not be budget, because consumers may be doing this as a hobby. They may be trying to generate revenue with it, but their strategies may be flawed, potentially severely flawed, to the extent where that revenue may never be coming, which means that the conversation with you and your product in terms of whether or not it's worth investing into is very different with consumers than it is for businesses. So I strongly recommend, and the vast majority of the content I'm producing is all B2B oriented. I'm only building SaaS products for businesses for those reasons and more. But even beyond that, even if you're talking about multiple business customers, you need to make sure which one you need to be laser focused on, because that is going to be where the source of where you're going to go to find new opportunities to build features and functionality around to strengthen your product's value proposition. And if you're chasing anything else, it has the potential to turn your product into a convoluted mess.